The first time my blind grandmother told me not to open a door, I laughed. The last time she told me not to open a door, it saved my life. The warning came 31 hours before the zombie outbreak officially began. At the time, nobody called it an outbreak. Nobody called it anything. It was just another rainy Thursday afternoon in Ashford, Pennsylvania. I was 17, old enough to think I understood how the world worked, young enough to be completely wrong. My father was finishing a plumbing job across town. My mother was working a double shift at the hospital, and I was supposed to be helping my grandmother sort boxes in the attic. Instead, I was sitting on the floor scrolling through my phone while she worked. "You're useless, Caleb." Grandma Evelyn smiled when she said it. She always smiled, even after she lost her sight. Maybe especially after. Blindness had never made her bitter. If anything, it made her sharper. She could identify family members by footsteps, recognize neighbors by the sound of their car engines, know when somebody was lying from a single sentence. My father used to joke that losing her eyesight had improved everything else. I used to think he was exaggerating. Then she suddenly stopped moving. The cardboard box in her hands froze. Her smile disappeared. That alone was enough to get my attention. "Grandma?" She tilted her head, listening, not toward me, toward the attic stairs, toward the hallway below. Her expression changed. Not fear, concern, the kind of concern people get when they hear something that doesn't belong. "What?" I stood up. "What is it?" She remained silent, listening. Then finally she asked, "Your father come home?" I frowned. "No." "You sure?" "Yeah." She slowly set the box down. Her fingers trembled slightly. That scared me, because my grandmother didn't scare easily. "What happened?" Another pause, then she said, "Thought I heard him." I laughed. "Grandma, Dad's at work." "I know." The answer came immediately. Too immediately, as if she'd already considered that possibility. I walked toward the attic window. Rain tapped against the glass. The driveway below was empty. No truck, no visitors. Nothing. "Nobody's here." She nodded, but she didn't look convinced. For the rest of the afternoon, she seemed distracted. Not frightened, just distracted, like somebody trying to remember something important. Every few minutes, she'd pause, listen, then continue working. By dinner, I'd almost forgotten about it. She hadn't. I realized that around 8:30 that night, the rain had gotten heavier. Power flickered twice. Mom still wasn't home from the hospital. Dad was watching baseball in the living room. Everything felt normal, until Grandma Evelyn suddenly spoke from her recliner. "Caleb," I looked up from my phone. "What? If somebody knocks tonight?" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. Then, "Don't answer." Dad laughed immediately. "What are we, in a horror movie now?" Grandma didn't smile, didn't react, didn't acknowledge the joke. She simply repeated herself. "Don't answer." The room felt strangely quiet afterward. My father muted the television. "Mom." His voice softened. "What's wrong?" She stared toward the dark window. Blind eyes focused on nothing, and somehow that made it worse. Then she said something none of us understood. "Some voices are coming home before the people do." Nobody spoke, because nobody knew what that meant, including her. I think that's what unsettled me most. She wasn't trying to sound mysterious. She sounded genuinely confused, like she'd noticed something she couldn't explain. Dad eventually changed the subject. The baseball game resumed. Life continued. But a seed had been planted. And once certain ideas enter your head, they stay there. Especially when the house becomes quiet. Especially when rain keeps falling. Especially when your blind grandmother sounds afraid. The next morning started with screaming. Not from our house, from somewhere down the street. I woke up around 6:30. The sound was brief, a woman yelling, then silence. I sat upright in bed. Waited, listened. Nothing. Just rain, the same rain that had fallen all night. Eventually I convinced myself I'd imagined it, half asleep. Dreaming. Whatever. Then my phone buzzed. A news notification. Local police respond to violent incident at gas station. No details, no explanation. Just another headline. The kind nobody remembers. Later that day, everybody would remember it. At breakfast, Grandma barely touched her food. Dad noticed. So we're still doing the creepy prophet thing? She ignored him. Thomas. Dad sighed. What? Something's wrong. The words landed heavily. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. No drama, no emotion, simple certainty. Dad rubbed his forehead. Mom. I know. You don't know. She turned her head toward him. No. Her voice dropped. I know. Nobody had an answer to that. Not even Dad. The hospital called my mother an hour later. Mandatory overtime, staff shortages, several emergency admissions overnight. She sounded exhausted. I remember because she called while I was helping Dad load tools into his truck. Everything okay? Dad asked. Mom hesitated. Then, honestly, my stomach tightened. Not really. She rarely said things like that. Dad noticed too. What happened? People are acting strange. The statement sounded ridiculous, even then. Dad laughed. What does that mean? I don't know. She sounded frustrated. 12 patients from 3 different locations. Okay. They're all saying the same thing. That got his attention. What thing? Silence, then. That somebody is calling them. Dad frowned. What? Never mind, Mom exhaled heavily. I've been awake 20 hours. She sounded embarrassed, like she regretted mentioning it. The conversation ended soon afterward. Neither of us thought much about it, at least not yet. That changed at 2:13 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was walking home from school when I saw the first infected person. Nobody called him infected. Not then. He was just a man sitting on a bus stop bench, middle-aged, wearing a gray jacket, completely motionless. At first I thought he was asleep. Then I noticed something strange. People kept talking to him. He never responded. A woman touched his shoulder. Nothing. A teenager waved a hand in front of his face. Nothing. The man simply sat there, staring, listening, waiting. I don't know why that bothered me. It should have been harmless. Yet I crossed the street anyway. Instinct. Nothing more. As I passed, his head turned, slowly toward me. I felt every hair on my arm stand up. Not because he looked dangerous, because he looked familiar. For one impossible second, I thought he was my father. The resemblance vanished immediately. Wrong age, wrong face, wrong everything. Yet the feeling remained. Recognition. A strange, irrational recognition. Then the man spoke, very quietly, almost too quietly to hear. Coming home. I stopped walking. What? The man didn't answer, didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. And suddenly I wanted to be anywhere else. I hurried away, never looking back. That night I told nobody about it. I wish I had. The official outbreak began at 1:07 a.m. Our family learned about it 4 hours earlier. The knock came at 9:15, 3 slow knocks, nothing unusual. Just a knock. Dad was in the kitchen. I was doing homework. Grandma sat silently in her recliner. The moment the sound echoed through the house, she stood, instantly, faster than I'd seen her move in years. No! Dad looked up. What? Another knock, 3 slow taps. Grandma gripped the armrest. No! The fear in her voice froze the room. Dad walked toward the front door. Mom, relax. Thomas. She sounded desperate. Don't. He stopped. Not because he agreed, because she'd never sounded like that before. Why? Then came the sentence that would haunt me forever. Don't open the door. Silence. The rain hammered against the windows. Nobody moved. Then she added, even if your father begs. The room went completely still. Dad stared at her. What? Grandma's hands trembled. Blind eyes fixed toward the entrance, as if she could somehow see through it. Even if your father begs. My pulse accelerated. Grandma, your father? She nodded slowly. Don't open it. Another knock interrupted her. 3 more taps. Slow, patient, waiting. Dad looked through the peephole, then immediately stepped back. Color drained from his face. I saw it happen. Actually watched it happen. What's wrong? He didn't answer. Dad? Finally he whispered, It's Grandpa. Nobody spoke because Grandpa Howard had been dead for 11 years. And somebody was standing outside wearing his face. Nobody moved. For several seconds the entire house seemed to stop breathing. Rain hammered the roof. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. But inside our living room, silence took over. Dad remained frozen beside the front door. His hand still rested near the lock. I had never seen my father look frightened before. Angry? Plenty of times. Stressed? Every week. Scared? Never. Until that moment. That's not possible. His voice sounded hollow. Grandma Evelyn slowly sat back down. The tension in her body somehow looked worse than panic. It looked like recognition. Like she'd been expecting this. Dad? I stepped closer. What do you mean? He swallowed hard, then looked at me. Your grandfather is standing on our porch. Every rational part of my brain rejected the statement instantly. Grandpa Howard had died from a stroke when I was 6. I barely remembered him. A fishing trip, a Christmas sweater, a deep laugh. That's it. Dead people didn't stand on porches. Dead people didn't knock on doors. Dead people didn't come home. Another knock interrupted my thoughts. 3 slow taps, exactly the same rhythm. Patient, controlled, almost polite. Then came a voice. Tommy. Dad physically flinched. I saw it. Actually saw him recoil, because nobody had called him Tommy in years. Not since Grandpa died. The voice continued. Might want to let me in. My pulse exploded. The voice sounded real, perfectly real, not distorted, not monstrous, not obviously fake. Just a tired older man standing outside during a rainstorm. As if this entire situation made sense. As if dead men regularly visited family members. Dad reached for the lock. Grandma stood again. No! The word cracked through the room like a gunshot. Dad stopped immediately. She pointed directly toward the door. Not at whoever stood behind it. At the door itself. That's not him. The voice outside chuckled softly. A familiar grandfatherly laugh. One I recognized from old home videos. One Dad definitely recognized. Evie. The voice sounded hurt. Why would you say that? Grandma's face tightened. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine terror there. Not fear, terror. Because Howard never called me Evie. Silence. Complete silence. Even the thing outside didn't respond immediately. Dad frowned. What? Grandma turned toward him. Your father hated that nickname. My stomach tightened. She was right. I remembered hearing that story. Grandpa always called her Evelyn. Never Evie. Not once. The voice outside finally spoke again. And somehow it sounded different now. Subtly different. Not enough for certainty. Enough for doubt. We all forget things. Grandma shook her head. No. The answer came instantly. Not that. The voice stopped talking. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody heard anything except rain. Then footsteps moved across the porch. Slowly, deliberately, toward the front window. The curtains were open. The realization hit me too late. Something appeared outside the glass. A face, an old man's face, gray hair, wrinkled skin, water dripping from a raincoat. Grandpa Howard, or something pretending to be him. I couldn't breathe, because it looked perfect. Not mostly correct. Perfect. Every detail matched the photographs hanging in our hallway. The thing stared through the window. Not at me, at Grandma, and then it smiled. Not a warm smile, not a loving smile, a curious smile. Like a scientist observing an experiment, like it had finally found the one person refusing to play along. Then the emergency alert arrived. Every phone in the house vibrated simultaneously. Mine, Dad's, Mom's. The television interrupted programming. A warning banner appeared. Multiple violent incidents reported across the state. Remain indoors. Do not respond to unknown visitors. Report unusual behavior immediately. The room went silent because every person inside that house had just witnessed something unusual standing outside. When we looked back toward the window, the figure was gone. Just gone. No footsteps, no vehicle, nothing, only rain, and a wet footprint on the porch. One footprint, not leaving, approaching, as if it had appeared there instead of arriving. That was the moment I stopped believing this would be a normal emergency. And somewhere beyond our neighborhood, people had already started dying. The outbreak became public before sunrise. The truth became personal much faster. Mom arrived home around midnight, exhausted, shaking, still wearing hospital scrubs, stained with rainwater. The moment she entered, Dad locked the door behind her, then locked it again. Mom noticed immediately. What happened? Nobody knew where to begin, so Dad simply said, "Something came to the house." That was enough, because whatever she'd seen at the hospital had apparently lowered her standards for impossible explanations. She didn't laugh, didn't question him, didn't demand evidence. Instead, she asked, "What did it look like?" That question terrified me. Not what she asked, how quickly she asked it, as if she'd already learned appearances couldn't be trusted. Dad explained everything. The knocks, the voice, the face, the nickname mistake. Grandma listened quietly, then Mom slowly sat down. "You saw one too?" Dad froze. "What?" Her face looked pale beneath the kitchen lights. "We had a patient." Nobody interrupted. He kept insisting his wife was visiting him. Mom swallowed. The problem was his wife died 3 years ago. A chill crawled through my body. Mom continued. He became violent when security wouldn't let her into the room. Dad stared. "What happened?" The answer came immediately. "Nobody ever found her." Silence then. The cameras didn't show anyone entering. The room felt smaller, suddenly, oppressively. Because impossible stories stop feeling impossible once enough people tell them. Mom rubbed her eyes. There were more cases. More? She nodded. Different people, different hospitals, different families. Same claims. Dead relatives, missing spouses, old friends, people appearing where they shouldn't, people asking to come inside. Grandma listened carefully, then asked a question nobody else considered. "Did anyone let them in?" Mom hesitated. The hesitation answered everything. "Some did." My pulse accelerated. "What happened?" Mom looked toward the window, toward the darkness outside, then whispered, "They disappeared." Nobody spoke, because nobody wanted details. Nobody wanted confirmation. The human mind has limits, and ours were already bending. At 2:11 a.m., the power failed. The entire neighborhood vanished into darkness. Televisions died, lights disappeared, air conditioners stopped humming. Silence spread across the street. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, dangerous. Everyone moved toward the living room. Not because it was safer, because people gather together when they're afraid. Even adults, especially adults. Dad found flashlights. Mom gathered supplies. Grandma sat quietly in her chair, listening, always listening. Then she suddenly raised her hand. The gesture immediately silenced everyone. "What?" Dad whispered. Grandma tilted her head toward the hallway, toward the front of the house, listening. I heard nothing. Then, very faintly, a voice, outside, not knocking, talking, almost whispering. "Dad?" My blood turned cold, because it sounded like my voice, exactly like my voice. The voice continued, "Dad?" Dad slowly turned toward me. I was standing right beside him. Yet another version of my voice drifted through the darkness. From outside, from the porch, from behind the front door. Grandma closed her eyes. They're learning. Nobody understood what she meant, at least not yet. By morning, civilization had started cracking. Not collapsing, cracking. The difference matters. Collapse is obvious. Cracks are dangerous because people pretend they aren't there. Cell service worked intermittently. Internet connections failed randomly. Emergency broadcasts contradicted each other. Some officials urged evacuation. Others demanded shelter in place. Nobody seemed to know what was happening. That uncertainty infected everything. Fear spreads faster when nobody agrees on reality. Around 9 o'clock, our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Carver, appeared at our door. Actually appeared. Not a copy, not an imitation. The real woman. Dad verified through the window before opening it. Even then, he barely unlocked the chain. Mrs. Carver looked terrified. Thank God! She rushed inside, then immediately checked every window, every room, every shadow. What happened? Mom asked. Mrs. Carver looked close to tears. My husband. Nobody spoke. He died last year. The room went silent, because we already knew where the story was heading. Mrs. Carver nodded, as if reading our thoughts. He knocked on my door. My stomach dropped. He knew things. She wiped her eyes. Private things. Details, memories, conversations. Things nobody else should know. The pattern matched perfectly, which meant it was happening everywhere. Not just here, not just us. Every family carried ghosts now, and the ghosts wanted invitations. Around noon, the first infected appeared on our street. Not one of the mimic visitors. Something else. Something worse. A teenage boy staggered into the neighborhood. Maybe 16, maybe 17. His clothes were soaked with blood and mud. He moved erratically, disoriented. Lost. Several residents stepped outside, trying to help, trying to understand. Normal people doing normal things. Then the boy attacked. The illusion shattered instantly. Screaming erupted. People ran. Doors slammed shut. The teenager moved with terrifying speed. Not supernatural speed. Human speed stripped of hesitation. And hesitation is what normally limits violence. Without it, humans become frightening. Dad pulled me away from the window. Don't watch. But I already had. I saw neighbors dragging injured people indoors. I saw panic spreading house by house. I saw the exact moment everyone realized authorities weren't coming quickly enough. The outbreak had finally arrived in our neighborhood. Not on television, not on radio broadcasts. Here. Now. Real. And somehow that wasn't the most frightening part. The most frightening part came 20 minutes later. The infected teenager collapsed in the middle of the street, motionless. Dead. At least he looked dead. Then every dog in the neighborhood started barking at the same time. Every single one. Not at the body. At something behind it. Something nobody else could see yet. Grandma stood up immediately, her face drained of color. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she sounded completely certain. Lock everything. Dad froze. Why? Grandma turned toward the front door, toward the darkness beyond it, toward whatever had made every dog react simultaneously. Then she whispered, because they're not the hunters. My heart stopped. What? She pointed toward the dead teenager lying in the road. The infected. A pause. Then, they're running from something too. Outside, somewhere beyond the neighborhood. A knock echoed through the afternoon. Not on our door, not nearby, far away, yet somehow every person in the house heard it. 3 slow taps, patient, waiting, coming closer. The first person to leave the neighborhood after the outbreak reached our street was Mr. Keegan. He lived 3 houses down. Retired firefighter, 68 years old. Built like a brick wall. The kind of man who spent his entire life running toward danger. By the 5th day, he couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. Nobody could. Power failures were increasing. Water pressure was becoming unreliable. Emergency broadcasts had devolved into fragments. Every rumor sounded believable because reality kept outperforming imagination. So Mr. Keegan gathered supplies, loaded his truck, and announced he was heading for a National Guard checkpoint 20 miles east. Several neighbors tried to stop him, not because they knew it was unsafe, because nobody knew anything. That was the problem. The world had become a place where every decision felt equally dangerous. Before leaving, Mr. Keegan knocked on our door. The real Mr. Keegan. Dad verified twice, then opened it. "If the checkpoint's real, I'll come back." Dad nodded. "If." The older man smiled. "If." Then he climbed into his pickup and drove away. That was the last time we saw him alive. Or at least the last time we saw the real version of him. The copy came back after sunset. The truck rolled into the neighborhood around 8:30 p.m. Everybody noticed immediately. People still watched the streets from windows. Nobody trusted silence anymore. The pickup parked in front of Mr. Keegan's house. The driver's door opened. Mr. Keegan stepped out, then just stood there, not moving, not unloading supplies, not entering his house, just standing beside the truck, watching. The sight pulled neighbors toward windows, toward curtains, toward tiny openings in blinds. Human curiosity refusing to die. Mom watched through binoculars. Dad watched from the upstairs bedroom. I watched from behind them. Grandma didn't watch at all. She listened, always listened. Then she quietly said, "That's not him." Nobody responded, because everyone already knew. Something about the figure felt wrong. Not visibly wrong, not obviously wrong. Just empty, like somebody performing a role without understanding why humans perform it. The figure remained beside the truck for nearly 40 minutes, then slowly walked toward his front door. He didn't use a key, didn't knock, didn't enter. He simply stood there, facing the house, motionless, waiting. At 9:14 p.m., Mrs. Keegan opened the door. Nobody knows exactly what happened afterward, because she opened it only a few inches, then disappeared from view. The figure entered, the door closed, and the house went dark. We never saw Mrs. Keegan again. That night, nobody slept. Not because of fear, because fear had evolved into something else. Pattern recognition. Every person in the neighborhood was trying to understand the rules. The infected had rules. The copies had rules. The knockers had rules. Survival depended on identifying them before the rules identified you. Around 2 a.m., I found Grandma sitting alone in the kitchen. The room was dark except for moonlight. She wasn't sleeping. She rarely slept now, just listened. "Grandma?" She smiled faintly. "I know why you're here." I sat across from her. "Do you? You want to know why I recognize them?" Straight to the point, always. I nodded. The silence stretched. Then she spoke. "Because this isn't the first outbreak." The statement hit me like a physical blow. "What?" Her blind eyes remained fixed toward the window, toward darkness, toward memory. "When I was a little girl," she paused, "something happened." My pulse accelerated. "Another outbreak?" She slowly shook her head. "No." The answer surprised me. Then she continued. "A smaller version." The room suddenly felt colder. "In 1957, she folded her hands. There was a town near where I grew up. I listened carefully. So did Dad. He'd quietly entered the kitchen without either of us noticing. Grandma continued. People disappeared. No drama, no theatrics, just facts. The stories were always the same. A pause. Someone heard a familiar voice. Another pause. They opened a door. The silence afterward felt heavy. Dad finally spoke. "Why didn't anybody know about this?" Grandma laughed softly. "Not because it was funny, because history often disappears when enough people want it to. It never became public." The answer came instantly. "Why?" "Because it stopped." That made no sense. Dad frowned. "How?" Grandma's expression darkened. "The town burned." Nobody spoke. The implications settled slowly, painfully. Then she said something that terrified me. "The voices were there first." "What voices?" The knockers, her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. They always come first. Outside, somewhere beyond our street, a distant knock echoed through the darkness. 3 slow taps, like an answer. The 6th day brought the first organized survivors. Not military, not police, just people. 23 of them, families from nearby neighborhoods. Teachers, mechanics, construction workers. A pharmacist. Ordinary people trying to build something resembling safety. They arrived in a convoy shortly after sunrise. 6 vehicles, 2 trailers, enough supplies to matter. Enough people to change the balance. Their leader was a woman named Carmen Diaz, former disaster coordinator, 42 years old, calm in a way that made other people calmer. The moment she stepped out of her truck, she began asking questions, real questions, not rumors, not theories, patterns, behavior, evidence. Within an hour, she had learned more than most emergency broadcasts. Within 2 hours, she reached the same conclusion Grandma already knew. The infected weren't the primary threat. The knockers were. That realization split the neighborhood immediately. Half the residents agreed. Half thought it sounded insane. Zombies made sense. Dead relatives asking permission to enter houses did not. Human beings prefer understandable nightmares, even terrible ones. Carmen organized a meeting that evening. Everyone gathered in the cul-de-sac, nearly 80 people, children, parents, grandparents, survivors. The atmosphere felt fragile, like civilization trying to imitate itself. Carmen stood beside a folding table, maps spread before her. We need rules, simple, direct, practical. Nobody argued with that. Then she began listing them. Never open a door without visual confirmation. Never respond to voices through walls. Never investigate nighttime knocks. Never travel alone. Never follow somebody because they know personal information. Every rule felt absurd and completely necessary. Then Grandma stood. The crowd quieted immediately. Not because she demanded attention, because everybody had started listening when she spoke. I want to add one, Carmen nodded. Grandma faced the crowd. If somebody begs, her voice softened, do not open the door. The silence afterwards felt enormous, because every person there imagined someone, a spouse, a child, a parent, a friend, the person they'd struggle most to refuse. Grandma continued, they know who you'll open for. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned her. Because deep down, everyone already suspected it was true. The outbreak wasn't targeting flesh. It was targeting attachment, memory, love, trust, everything that normally makes people human. That night, the knocking returned. Not at our house, at multiple houses, simultaneously. Different streets, different doors, different voices. The neighborhood radio network exploded with reports. My wife is outside. My son is knocking. My brother's at the back door. Panic spread instantly. Not because people believed. Because they wanted to believe. That's what made it dangerous. At 11:47 p.m., one of the radios transmitted screaming. Everybody heard it. The sound lasted less than 10 seconds. Then silence. The house belonged to the Nelson family. By morning, it was empty, completely empty. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just absence, and an open front door. The pattern repeated 3 more times over the next 48 hours. Every missing family had one thing in common. They opened the door, no exceptions, no survivors, no second chances. By the end of the week, nobody doubted Grandma anymore. The problem was that belief arrived too late for some people, just like every warning in history. On the 8th night, I heard my father's voice outside my bedroom window. The real dad was downstairs, sleeping on the couch. Yet another version stood outside, calling my name, quietly, patiently, like someone trying not to wake the rest of the house. Ryan, my blood froze. The voice sounded perfect. Exactly perfect. Not close. Perfect. Ryan, I didn't move. Didn't answer. Didn't breathe. Then the voice changed. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, the warmth disappeared. The patience disappeared. Something colder emerged underneath. Ryan. The third time sounded less human, not monstrous, just unfinished, like a mask slipping. I pulled the blanket tighter. The voice continued for nearly 20 minutes. Then stopped, abruptly. No footsteps, no departure, nothing, only silence. The next morning, Grandma asked me a question before I mentioned anything. Did you answer? I stared. No. She nodded once, relieved, then quietly whispered, Good. I swallowed. How did you know? Grandma's expression darkened, because she already knew the answer, and apparently hated it. Because they're getting closer. Outside, beyond the neighborhood barricades, a distant chorus of knocks echoed through the morning air. Not one door, not two, dozens, maybe hundreds. And for the first time, even Carmen looked afraid, because whatever was coming next, the knockers no longer seemed interested in individual houses. They were gathering. The first volunteer was a man named Eric Holloway. Nobody forced him, nobody tricked him, nobody even encouraged him. That was what made it so disturbing. Eric was 35, former paramedic, practical, level-headed, the kind of person who demanded evidence before making decisions. For days he had listened to stories about the knockers, stories about voices, stories about missing people, stories about doors opening. But stories weren't enough for him. He wanted proof, hard proof, something measurable, something real. On the 10th morning of the outbreak, he announced his plan. I'm going to let one in. The neighborhood meeting exploded instantly. People shouted, argued, threatened, begged. Eric listened patiently, then shook his head. We're operating on fear. Carmen folded her arms. We're operating on survival. Same thing right now. Nobody liked that answer, especially Grandma. She remained silent for most of the discussion. Then finally spoke. If you do this, everyone looked toward her. You won't learn what you think you'll learn. Eric smiled politely, the way people smile at elderly relatives they think are mistaken. Maybe. Grandma lowered her head. No. The certainty in her voice silenced the crowd. You'll only teach it more about you. Eric left anyway. That night he prepared his house, cameras, flashlights, radio equipment, multiple witnesses, everything documented, everything controlled. The entire neighborhood watched remotely through short-range radios and camera feeds, including us. At 11:23 p.m., the knocking started, 3 slow taps, exactly as expected. Eric sat in his living room, alone, calm, prepared. The voice arrived seconds later. His wife, dead for 4 years. Cancer. The entire neighborhood knew the story. The voice sounded flawless, soft, warm, familiar. Eric. Nobody in the listening group spoke. Nobody moved. The voice continued. I miss you. Eric's face tightened. Just slightly, but we all saw it, because grief never leaves. It just learns how to stay quiet. The voice continued speaking. Memories, private moments, shared experiences, specific details. Every sentence chipped away at certainty. Every sentence sounded more real than the last. Then came the moment that changed everything. Eric opened the door. Not fully, just enough. A few inches. The cameras captured everything. The porch, the darkness, the figure. A woman standing beneath the streetlight. His wife. Perfect, identical. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. Then Eric whispered, "Oh my God!" The figure smiled and stepped forward. The camera feed died instantly. Every monitor went black. Every radio erupted with static. For nearly 15 seconds, nobody heard anything. Then Eric's voice returned. Only 3 words. Don't come here. The transmission ended. We never heard him again. The next morning, Carmen led a recovery team. 12 armed volunteers, broad daylight, maximum visibility. No risks ignored. They entered Eric's house cautiously. Room by room, floor by floor, nothing. No Eric, no body, no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, only absence. Exactly like every previous disappearance. Except for one thing. A map, spread across Eric's kitchen table, covered in markings, dozens of them. Circles, notes, locations, coordinates. Carmen brought it directly to our house because one location appeared more often than any other. A place nearly 80 miles north. An abandoned monastery, deep in the mountains. Grandma stared at the map. Her expression changed immediately. The moment she saw the monastery name, Dad noticed. So you know it? Grandma nodded slowly. I hoped I was wrong. Nobody liked that answer, especially Carmen. What is it? The old woman remained silent for several seconds, then finally spoke. The place where the first town burned. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because suddenly the story from 1957 wasn't history anymore. It was connected, directly connected. By afternoon, the neighborhood faced a decision: stay or leave. The infected population was growing, the knockers were multiplying, and now there appeared to be a destination, a source, a center, something pulling events together. Carmen believed answers might exist there. Dad believed answers didn't matter anymore. Mom wanted safety. I wanted certainty. Nobody got what they wanted. In the end, reality chose for us. The attack began just before sunset, not by knockers, not by infected, both, together, for the first time. The infected arrived from the south, dozens of them, moving through neighborhoods, forcing barricades, creating chaos. At the same moment, voices began calling from every direction. Families, friends, children, parents. The neighborhood defense plan collapsed instantly because people weren't fighting one threat. They were fighting memory and violence simultaneously, and memory proved harder. I watched a grown man abandon his barricade because his daughter was calling for help. The real daughter stood beside him, crying, begging him not to go. He almost followed the voice anyway. That's how powerful it was. The infected attacked bodies. The knockers attacked judgment. Together they were devastating. By midnight, Carmen ordered evacuation. The neighborhood could not hold. Not anymore. Not against both threats, and definitely not after losing so many people. We packed everything that mattered into 2 vehicles, which turned out to be surprisingly little. Food, medicine, tools, photos, the essentials of human life reduced quickly during collapse. At 1:17 a.m., we left home. I never saw our house again. The convoy contained 41 survivors, 12 vehicles, 1 destination, the monastery. Not because we trusted it, because every clue pointed there, and because every other option looked worse. The drive north felt surreal. Entire towns sat abandoned. Roadblocks stood empty. Gas stations remained frozen in half-finished moments. The world looked interrupted, not destroyed. Interrupted. Like somebody had pressed pause on civilization. The first serious loss happened on the second day. A woman named Denise disappeared during a fuel stop. One moment she was helping unload supplies. The next she was gone. No screams, no struggle, nothing, just absence. Then we found footprints leading into the woods. Only one set. Hers, as if she'd walked away willingly. Following someone, or something. Nobody followed. Not because they didn't care, because everyone understood the risk. Some decisions become impossible after enough evidence. That realization haunted us all. The mountains appeared late that afternoon. Dark shapes against the horizon. Silent. Waiting. Grandma watched them through the windshield. Her expression never changed, but I noticed something. She wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering. That frightened me, because memory can be worse than fear. Fear concerns what might happen. Memory concerns what already happened. As night approached, she finally spoke. They wanted us here. Nobody answered, because everyone had reached the same conclusion. The route markers, the disappearances, the monastery, the voices, everything felt guided, not controlled, guided like pieces moving toward a destination. And destinations imply purpose. We reached the monastery on day 13. The structure stood alone atop a rocky ridge. Ancient stone walls, collapsed towers, weather-damaged buildings. The place looked abandoned, had looked abandoned for decades, yet hundreds of footprints surrounded it. Fresh footprints, recent footprints, human footprints. The sight chilled everyone, because it meant people had been arriving. Many people, for a long time. Carmen organized search teams. Dad joined one, against Mom's wishes, against my wishes, against common sense. But somebody had to learn what waited inside. The monastery contained no infected, no knockers, no survivors, only evidence. Mountains of evidence, photographs, journals, maps, records spanning decades. The realization hit slowly. Then all at once, this wasn't the first outbreak. Not even close. Smaller incidents, localized disappearances, entire communities erased quietly. Again and again and again, for nearly a century. Always centered around the monastery, always ending before becoming public, always hidden. Until now. This time was different. This time it hadn't stopped. This time it had escaped. And somewhere beneath the monastery, something was still waiting. At sunset, Carmen found the entrance, a stairway leading underground, into darkness, into history, into the place nobody had wanted to find. Grandma stood at the top step, listening, then quietly whispered, "It's awake." The words echoed through the stone corridor. And for the first time since the outbreak began, nobody wanted answers anymore. But we were already too close to turn back. Nobody volunteered to go underground. That was the first honest thing that happened all week. Carmen didn't want to. Dad didn't want to. I definitely didn't want to. But the monastery had become more than a destination. It had become an explanation. And explanations have gravity. People move toward them even when they know they'll regret it. The stairway descended deep beneath the monastery. Stone walls, cold air, ancient architecture that felt older than the buildings above. Flashlights cut narrow tunnels through darkness. Every sound echoed, footsteps, breathing, equipment shifting against backpacks. Nothing else. No infected. No voices. No knocks. That silence felt wrong, because after nearly 2 weeks of constant pressure, the absence of threat felt more threatening than danger itself. Grandma remained above ground. For the first time since the outbreak began, she refused to follow. That decision alone terrified me, because Grandma never avoided difficult truths. If she stayed behind, it meant she already knew what waited below. About 30 minutes into the descent, we found the records. Thousands of them, boxes, shelves, entire rooms filled with journals, letters, photographs, documents. Generations of people had come here, studied here, warned others, failed repeatedly. One journal sat open on a desk. Its final entry had been written nearly 60 years earlier. Dad read it aloud. The room fell silent. "They do not wear faces." A pause. "They wear memory." Another. "They arrive as recognition." Nobody spoke, because every word matched our experience perfectly. Then Carmen turned another page and discovered the part that changed everything. The knockers were not creating copies. They were borrowing expectations. The thing outside the door became whatever the person inside most wanted to trust. Not because it understood love, because it understood access. The realization hit hard. The knockers weren't emotional predators. They were practical predators. Love was simply the easiest key, and humanity kept handing it over. An hour later, we reached the lowest chamber. The tunnel opened into a vast underground room. Natural stone, ancient walls, a cavern older than the monastery itself. The center contained something unexpected. Not a monster, not a creature, not anything physical. A sound, a low vibration, almost below hearing, yet impossible to ignore. It seemed to move through the rock itself, through the air, through us. I watched hardened adults stop walking. Not from fear, from instinct. Every person in the room reacted differently. Some looked emotional, others looked angry. A few started crying without understanding why. The vibration wasn't speaking, it was reminding. Fragments, memories, associations. The sensation felt intimate, violating, like somebody reading a diary you didn't know existed. Then Dad suddenly grabbed my shoulder. Hard, too hard. His face had changed. What happened? For several seconds he couldn't answer. Then, I heard my mother. His voice cracked. His mother had died 20 years earlier. And suddenly everyone understood. The vibration wasn't random. It searched. It found emotional pathways. It amplified them. The knockers weren't independent creatures. They were extensions, messengers, projections, tools. The real threat had always been here. Beneath the mountain, calling outward, searching for doors, searching for people, searching for entry. The deeper truth emerged through the journals. Not all at once, piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle nobody wanted completed. Nearly 90 years earlier, a geological survey team had discovered the cavern. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then workers began reporting voices. Familiar voices, trusted voices, dead voices. The incident spread gradually. Families fractured, communities disappeared. People followed calls into forests, into rivers, into caves, anywhere the voices directed them. Every outbreak followed the same pattern: recognition, invitation, disappearance. The infected came later, always later. They weren't the source, they were a symptom. The vibration affected human cognition, memory, identity. Eventually, it damaged people completely. The infected represented minds that could no longer distinguish reality from emotional impulse. The realization horrified everyone, because it meant zombies weren't the primary disaster. The collapse of trust was, and trust had already collapsed worldwide. Then Carmen found the final journal, the newest one, written only weeks before the outbreak. Its author remained unnamed. The final entry contained a single observation. One sentence, one terrible sentence. It grows stronger every time somebody answers. The room went silent, because suddenly every missing person mattered. Every open door, every accepted invitation, every emotional surrender. The outbreak had been feeding itself, expanding through participation. Humanity wasn't merely suffering the phenomenon. Humanity was strengthening it. And now it had reached global scale. Dad slowly lowered the journal. What do we do? Nobody answered, because everyone already knew. The answer waited beneath the vibration, beneath the mountain, beneath everything. And none of us wanted to say it aloud. Grandma solved the problem. Even though she never entered the cavern, even though she never saw any of it, because she'd understood something nobody else had. The vibration relied on memory, recognition, association, identity, all forms of internal vision. But Grandma had lost her sight decades earlier. And over time, she learned something unusual. She trusted voices less than most people trusted faces. She verified, questioned, listened, compared. The knockers never fooled her because they depended on assumptions. And Grandma had spent years surviving without assumptions. When Carmen explained the journals, Grandma nodded immediately. As I thought, nobody liked hearing that. Dad sat beside her. You knew? No. She smiled sadly. I suspected. The distinction mattered, because certainty would have made this easier. Suspicion felt human. Then she revealed something she'd never told anyone. Back in 1957, she had opened a door. The room froze. What? Grandma lowered her head. I was 8. Nobody interrupted, because suddenly the story wasn't history anymore. It was personal. My brother was outside. Her voice trembled slightly. First time we'd ever heard that. I opened the door. The silence became painful. What happened? She closed her eyes. Nothing. That answer surprised everyone. Then she continued. Because my father stopped me. A pause. He realized it wasn't really my brother. Another pause. He saved me. The room understood immediately. History wasn't repeating. History was completing. The warning she'd given us came from experience. Not knowledge, not prophecy, experience. The most human thing imaginable. That night, Grandma made the final decision. Not Carmen, not Dad, Grandma. The cavern had to be sealed. Permanently, not destroyed, isolated, buried, cut off from human contact. The monastery sat above unstable rock formations. Old mining records confirmed it. A collapse was possible. Dangerous, but possible. The plan formed quickly. Explosives, structural weaknesses, controlled collapse, no guarantees, no certainty, only risk. Just like every important decision humanity ever makes, the final operation began before dawn. Nobody gave speeches. Nobody pretended bravery. People simply worked. That felt more honest. Dad helped place charges. Carmen coordinated teams. Volunteers evacuated survivors. Everyone understood the stakes. Nobody understood the outcome. As sunrise approached, the vibration intensified, even from outside the cavern. Voices drifted through the monastery. Thousands of them. Parents, children, spouses, friends. Every person heard something different. Every person faced a private temptation. I heard Grandpa, the real one, or at least something wearing him, promising safety, promising certainty, promising answers. For one terrible moment, I wanted to follow. Then I remembered Grandma. Blind, listening, questioning, surviving. And I kept walking. Around me, others did the same. Not because they were fearless, because they were finally learning. The voices grew desperate as evacuation finished. Less convincing, more urgent, as if whatever lived beneath the mountain realized access was ending. Then Carmen triggered the charges. The explosion shook the entire ridge. Stone collapsed, ground fractured, ancient tunnels vanished beneath thousands of tons of rock. The vibration stopped instantly, not faded. Stopped. The silence afterward felt impossible. For the first time since the outbreak began, my thoughts belonged entirely to me. No pressure, no whispering, no emotional tug. Just silence. Beautiful silence. And somewhere beneath a collapsed mountain, the thing that had spent decades knocking on humanity's door finally lost its path inside. 3 years have passed. The infected still exist. Some communities still struggle. The world never returned to what it was. It became something different. Smaller, slower, more careful. But the knockers never returned. Not once, no voices, no dead relatives, no midnight visitors. Nothing. Maybe the collapse worked. Maybe we simply bought time. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. People ask why my blind grandmother recognized the danger before anyone else. Researchers ask. Survivors ask. Journalists ask. They want a complicated answer. Something mystical, something extraordinary. The truth disappoints them. Grandma wasn't special. She was careful. Most people see something familiar and immediately trust it. Grandma spent decades learning not to. She listened harder, questioned more, verified everything. The outbreak exploited recognition. Grandma survived because she never confused recognition with truth. She died peacefully a year after the monastery collapsed. Natural causes, old age, nothing dramatic, nothing tragic, just the end of a long life. At her funeral, Dad said something I'll never forget. She taught us that love isn't opening every door. He looked toward the sky, then smiled sadly. Sometimes love is knowing which ones stay closed. And every time I remember those words, I think about that first warning. The one nobody understood. The one that saved our lives. Don't open the door. even if Dad begs.